Today we'll be talking about permanent revolution, which is commonly thought of as Trotsky's main contribution to Marxism or communism in general. But as we'll kind of start, it's not quite just Trotsky's idea. Um, but first, we'll have to start with the Russian Revolution to get a little bit of context for why this theory was created in the first place. So going back to the French Revolution, which happened during the late 1700s, Karl Marx observed how the business class was able to do away with the feudalist monarchy, ushering in a new wave of productive forces. Uh, this bounded French society forward in establishing representative democracy and land reform. During this time, there was an emergence of a large urban working class, walking hand in hand with a powerful bourgeois class in many cases. Workers did much of the fighting to break away from feudalism, yet benefited the least when compared to the new and powerful bourgeois class, perhaps because much of the new class was filled with the old remnants of feudal nobility. Although France was able to transition away from feudalism, they would soon find themselves in the throes of capitalism. The revolution had failed to liberate workers in the sense that greater social reform was never fully realized. France's proletariat would continue to be the hardest working class in France and also the most exploited. This is just one of many examples during the revolutions of 1848 and how the working class should expect nothing but treachery from the bourgeois. Similarly, in Germany, they were going through a revolution of their own, um, which was also halted by the liberal bourgeois class in Germany. To look at more recent events, we can look at the Chinese Revolution of 1949, and even more recent than that, the Arab Springs of 2011 in Egypt. They faced similar struggles with similar outcomes, with the capitalist class halting further progress once their own desires had been met. In Karl Marx's 1850 speech in London to the Central Committee of the Communist League, Marx theorized that it would not be possible to move directly from a feudal aristocracy to a society run by workers, and proposed that a period of bourgeois rule would be necessary to make this transition. Marx also acknowledged that the bourgeois would not willingly relinquish the control of the state and that a continued working class struggle, as he called it, a permanent revolution, would be necessary to achieve a socialist society. However, the Marxist analysis of history in the 20th century would see this as a formula set in stone, that it was always necessary to transition from feudalism to capitalism before socialism could ever be achieved. This staged approach would inspire other revolutionary actions across the world, often with disastrous results for the working class. Jumping decades later, Trotsky would expand on Marx's ideas as he witnessed the role of the Russian bourgeois in undermining any attempts in social progress. During this time in history, Russia was already behind much of Europe in industrialization. The heavily militarized state, ruled by the Tsarist autocracy and backed by the church, left the working class under the thumb of feudal nobility. Any talk of revolution was quickly abandoned by the bourgeois, resulting in street fights as workers clashed with the state. These events assured Trotsky that an independent working class struggle was indeed a necessity to carry out a socialist transformation of society. In contrast to the staged approach to socialism, adapted by many socialists of the early 20th century, Trotsky theorized that because different countries develop at different rates in the context of a globalized society, it would be possible for some sectors of society to leapfrog forward in a way that was not determined by their level of industrialization, but through their political development. In the context of Russia, unlike the working class in Britain, they had not gone through a century of reformist bourgeois democracy and had fewer illusions about capitalism in general. While workers may have been behind industrially, they were decades ahead politically. Similar to the staged approach, Lenin initially held similar beliefs, raising the slogan for a democratic dictatorship of workers and peasants. He sided with the early Marxist take that a democratic bourgeois revolution would be a necessary step towards achieving socialism for the masses. Trotsky, however, disagreed with this approach, having his own reservations about the peasant class, which was made largely of independent producers, would have little conviction to unify around the common demands of workers. He noted an agrarian revolution would not be possible under a purely bourgeois democratic revolution, and only a worker-led revolution would have the possibility of transforming society. In 1917, following the October Revolution, when a worker-led revolution took power, Lenin ends up changing his position to agree with Trotsky's theory. This struggle from below was able to take factories away from the industrialists as calls for nationalized industry began. So what are the specifics of a permanent revolution? A permanent revolution combines three primary concepts that we'll talk about in a little more depth in the next few slides. These concepts are being the transition from a bourgeois democrat revolution to a socialist revolution. Secondly, postponing socialist revolution into stages, quote, revolution of the economy, of technology, of science, of family, of customs, which unfold in a complex reciprocal action that does not allow society to reach equilibrium. And lastly, the international character of the socialist movement. A socialist revolution requires the acknowledgement that there is no separation from social struggles and class struggles. Gender equality, anti-racism, reproductive rights are all parts of class struggle due to the material effects they have on workers. To simply attain the right to vote for a representative or to own land are not goals of socialism. They may be part of it, but it's short-sighted to think that we achieve the end goal of socialism in this way, for these are primary mechanisms used by the capitalist state to manufacture consent and the illusion of choice. There is no guarantee that a revolution of the petty bourgeois will ever lead to a revolution of the proletariat. In fact, history suggests the opposite. That is, in fact, folly to accept the bourgeois to relinquish or even share the power that they attain. There is no class revolution if women are forced to stay home and bear children. There is no class revolution if immigrants and minorities are denied opportunities and treated as less than. This is a matter of worker autonomy and emancipation that begs to be realized. A permanent revolution is a revolution that is to free all oppressed people, making it necessary to address social issues such as feminism and LGBT rights, as these issues may only see their complete fruition through addressing the material conditions. Workers will not seize power or agency over their lives through any level of industrialization. It cannot be determined by it can only be determined by their strength and organization along with their political and class consciousness. Perhaps most importantly to mention, in these movements are not restricted through the, sorry, Perhaps most important to mention is these movements are not restricted through the discussion and acknowledgement of class politics. In fact, they are intertwined. Struggles around these modest political demands lead workers to actualize their own power. No longer isolated and starving, workers standing together will realize their power as they liberate one another from forces that only serve to divide them. Permanent revolution begins with a far-reaching and burning problem for the people, which demands for its solution the boldest revolutionary measures. Socialism was not fully achieved in Russia, primarily through its weakened state from the Civil War and its isolation from the world economy that otherwise was very interdependent. The revolution of the proletariat was no match for the full force of world imperialists looking to restore order out of fear the revolution may spread to threaten their own empire. Imperial threats aside, there is a necessity of cooperation at the very least. A country rich with raw materials will rely on another country with higher capabilities of production, and so on. Trotsky stated the revolution may begin in Russia, but to complete it, it will have no alternative but to link the fate of its political rule, and hence the fate of the whole Russian Revolution, with the fate of the socialist revolution in Europe. With the state power in its hands, with counter-revolution behind it, and European reaction in front of it, it will send forth to its comrades the world over the old rallying cry, which this time will be a call for the last attack. Workers of all countries, unite. Now we'll discuss some critics' take on the permanent revolution. As I'm sure many on this call are aware, this is a hotly contested theory amongst many leftists. One of the primary criticisms is that this idea of permanent revolution is Eurocentric, or it's an accomplice to colonialism. Sorry, I'm getting lost in my notes here. Some critics of permanent revolution, or just Marxism in general, will call it a variant of Western reason, that it's just colonialism in a different form, relating to the idea that true socialism cannot be realized without an international aspect. These arguments overlook some central issues. While they will readily point to the European history of colonialization across the world, mentioning Asia, Africa, North and South America, but they will exclude the Europe that facilitated the Paris Communards, the Russian and German revolutions, the uprising of the Spanish peasantry and the workers, the Prague Spring uprising against Stalin, the Carnation Revolution in Portugal, and there's many more that I'm not going to name here because I have a limited amount of time. Again, this can be countered with other ways of being in the world, oftentimes monolithizing pre-capitalist societies and cleansing them of critique. Critiques such as social subjugation, the oppression of women, caste or social hierarchies, interethnic violence, slaveries, etc. This is not to say that pre-capitalist societies did not have a positive side. There is much that people of today could learn from these older societies, but we must not excuse them of any recourse simply for not being capitalists. Trotsky, in fact, argues that nations develop at different rates, that there is no hard formula for liberation. To suggest Trotsky meant less developed nations should follow the lead of more developed nations goes against his observation that, as he called it, backward Russia was more politically developed than the bulk of Europe. Ecologically speaking, we share the earth and its resources with one another. This allows less resource-dense nations, or less developed nations, to work together to achieve greater goals. But what we see today in nations with the most power are allowed to hoard the most resources, and often at the exploitation of another. Internationalism aims to defeat this act for the good of people everywhere and for the health of the planet as a whole. Another critique that we often see of a permanent revolution is that permanent revolution is totalitarian. Perhaps in the sense that uniting a dictatorship of the international proletariat, yes. But I will state it again. The aim of permanent revolution is the freedom of all oppressed people. To suggest that this would come through a form of colonial oppression misses the heart of the issue, being that of enabling workers with the agency to govern themselves and actualize their own national emancipation. Perhaps this comes from the modern capitalist concept of freedom through assimilation, often in a movement led by a few bourgeois figureheads with capitalist agendas. As Marxists in the tradition of Lenin, Luxemburg, Engels, and yes, Trotsky, We oppose the deification of a great man or idea and instead encourage the self-emancipation of individuals through shared struggle and class consciousness. Now, that is not to say that should we find ourselves capable of assisting another nation and achieving their own revolution, that we should not help them. When Trotsky said socialism is only actualized at a national scale, he was stating the end game, the perceived ideal resolution of socialism as a whole. Again, this is backed by the interconnectedness of our world today and the opportunist imperial forces that hover above suffering people like vultures. To wrap things up, early on, Trotsky observed the interdependent nature of a highly globalized society, and that a militant, politically well-developed working class can still exist in an underdeveloped society, meaning lower industrialization. His theory of permanent revolution opposes the reformist multi-stage theories from establishing socialism, an idea that is still popular amongst leftists and liberals today. Today, perhaps more persistent among them is the thought that the right must be defeated first in order to establish a bourgeois democracy of liberals, and only then can a worker-led struggle begin. This goes against the numerous historical accounts where the bourgeois have proven to be uninterested in social reform that they do not expressly benefit from. History shows the only hope for a socialist reformation of society comes through a worker-led and international struggle. Only then can a true socialist society be achieved.